She left her Lexus parked in front of my tractor for the third time that week, blocking my only path to the field during peak harvest season. When I asked her politely to move it, she smirked and said, "It's just a tractor, not a tank." So, I hitched it to my John Deere 8R, rolled straight through her cones, and dragged her luxury car halfway into the soybean rows, radio blasting Willie Nelson while every neighbor filmed it from their porch. But that wasn't even the real revenge. That part came later, when she tried to press charges and found out who I really was. It had started out as a normal Tuesday on my 30-acre property tucked just outside of town. Roosters crowed. Sprinklers kicked on. The air smelled like freshly cut hay. I had coffee in one hand and my phone in the other as I read through the weather updates, hoping the rain would hold off long enough for me to finish harvesting the lower field. My name's Tom, and I've worked this land for 20 years. It's not a hobby farm. It's my life, my job, my sanity. The trouble started when the new HOA development, Maple Ridge Estates, popped up on the edge of my northern boundary. At first, I thought it would be a bunch of retirees and weekend gardeners. Then I met Karen. Karen was the kind of woman who walked like the sidewalk owed her money. Always in athleisure, always on a Bluetooth call, and always armed with some HOA pamphlet or policy guide. She introduced herself the first week she moved in by telling me I needed to trim the hedges on the shared line. I told her kindly that the hedges were on my property and that she could keep her suggestions for her Pinterest board. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. That morning, I opened my barn doors and immediately stopped dead in my tracks. Her shiny silver Lexus RX was parked directly in front of my tractor. Not next to it. Not near it. Directly in front, bumper almost touching the bucket loader. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was a blockade. She had parked on a narrow gravel path that looped through my barn gate and into my main harvest zone. This wasn't a street. It wasn't public. It was clearly marked with a private property sign bolted right into a post next to the fence. I sighed, walked around her car, and left a polite note. Just a gentle, neighborly reminder that this road wasn't for public use. I even signed it with my name and number. Then I went back inside to get a second cup of coffee. 15 minutes later, I heard yelling. At first I thought maybe some of my ranch hands had shown up early. Nope, it was Karen, standing next to her car with my note in one hand and her other hand on her hip like she was doing a yoga pose of pure judgment. "Did you leave this?" she shouted. "You don't own the road, cowboy." Her tone wasn't questioning, it was accusing. I calmly explained that yes, I did own the road, and pointed to the deed info carved into the boundary stone 20 feet away. She didn't even look. She ripped the note in half, threw it onto my gravel, got into her car, and backed out in a flurry of dust. I figured she'd gotten the message. I was wrong. The next morning, she was back, except this time, she'd upped the ante. She parked her car in the exact same spot and added orange cones around it. And not just any cones. She had dragged 4 full-sized road cones from who knows where and placed them in a neat rectangle around her Lexus like it was part of a construction site. There was even a little sign on her dash that said, "Authorized HOA vehicle, temporary parking okay." I nearly choked on my own spit. I called the HOA office listed on the Maple Ridge website, and to my surprise, I was told Karen had recently been named interim HOA president after a leadership shuffle. According to the woman on the phone, Karen was reassessing boundaries between community access areas and shared rural routes. I told her there was nothing to reassess. This was my land. The woman gave me that overly polite, bureaucratic response that basically translates to, "Good luck, sir." At this point, I could feel the rage building in my throat, but I decided to try once more. I walked out, waved at Karen who was casually watering a flower pot across the fence, and asked her to move the car. She raised her eyebrows like I'd just asked for her PIN number. "I'm busy," she said. "You'll live." Then she walked back into her house and shut the door like she was making a power move in some low-budget drama series. By Thursday, the gloves were off. I had a semi-load of alfalfa that needed to be moved before the afternoon rainstorm. My crew was on standby. We had bales lined up, fuel in the tanks, and my tractor humming. And there was Karen's Lexus, parked like a smug little trophy right in front of the exit again. This time, no cones. No note. Just pure defiance. I climbed up into the cab of my 8R, locked the doors, and took a slow breath. I wasn't angry anymore. I was surgical. I eased forward, maneuvered around the front end of her car, got the chain from my hitch latch, and looped it through the underside of her front tow mount. Then I rolled backward, tugged once to check stability, and dropped that machine into gear. The moment I started pulling her Lexus off the gravel path and into the soft green alfalfa, my neighbor Doug popped out of his shed with a cup of sweet tea and shouted, "Oh, she gonna cry." He wasn't wrong. By the time I got her car 100 feet into the field, dragging grass and dust behind it like a bridal veil, half the neighborhood was watching from their fences. I parked it gently between two rows, turned off the engine, and went back inside like it was just another part of my chore list. When Karen returned that evening, she screamed so loud you'd think she just found out she lost a reality show. She sprinted into my yard, banging on my door, demanding I bring her car back. I simply handed her a business card, with the name of the local tow company. "Field recovery isn't part of my job description," I said. She threatened to call the cops. I encouraged her to go ahead. I even offered her my phone. The real kicker? When the sheriff showed up, he laughed and told her flat out that the road and field were on my land. She looked like someone had just stolen the sprinkles off her cupcake. But that wasn't even the beginning of the fallout. Because the next day, Karen tried to hit back, and ended up finding out the one thing she never expected. I wasn't just a farmer. I was also the county's rural land assessor, and I had a very official say in her property's zoning permits. And that's when the war really began. The day after I dragged Karen's Lexus into my alfalfa field, I expected things to die down. I figured she'd take the humiliation on the chin and move on, maybe even keep her HOA antics contained to her side of the fence. But I had seriously underestimated just how deep her entitlement ran. By 9 a.m., I already had 3 missed calls from an unfamiliar number, and 1 voicemail that started mid-scream and ended with threats about lawsuits, property damage, and criminal towing offenses. Her voice cracked halfway through like a soap opera villain unraveling in front of a mirror. I didn't even finish listening. I deleted the voicemail and went out to check my tractor. To be honest, I thought maybe she'd egg my mailbox or scratch the side of my truck. That seemed more her speed, passive-aggressive, dramatic, and ultimately ineffective. But what I saw when I turned the corner of my barn stopped me cold. My private property sign, the big one I had bolted onto a treated post 3 years ago, was missing. Not just knocked over or defaced. Gone. The screws had been sheared clean off, and the post was snapped like someone had backed a car into it and then took the sign as a souvenir. My jaw locked up, not from surprise, but from how quickly she had escalated from annoying to destructive. And judging by the tracks in the dirt and the faint imprint of a tire near the fence line, I had a pretty good idea who was responsible. I didn't rush over there. No, I had something better. I walked back into my house, went to my desk drawer, and pulled out a manila folder that I hadn't touched in years. Inside were land surveys, signed easements, and my favorite document of all, a copy of my assessor's certification, issued by the very same county Karen was now trying to mess with. You see, I don't just farm. I also work part-time as a contracted assessor for the county's Rural Zoning Board. I've got the authority to inspect, audit, and recommend revocations of permits when properties violate setback rules, unauthorized construction, or abuse land use code. I had never used that authority outside official assignments, until now. While I was flipping through the paperwork, my neighbor Doug showed up on his ATV holding a fresh cup of gas station coffee and a grin that said he already knew the tea. "You see her out there?" he asked, gesturing toward the back of the Maple Ridge Estates lot. She's got some landscaping crew measuring the backyard with tape like she's about to build a tennis court. I raised an eyebrow. The county had strict guidelines about water runoff zones, especially for properties bordering farmland. If she was planning to build something large or permanent without clearance, she was walking herself right into my jurisdiction. I spent the next few hours preparing. I took photos of the missing sign, the tire marks, and the torn post. I made copies of my documents and even drafted a preliminary zoning report outlining potential violations I had observed from the public boundary line. All true, all legal. But before I filed anything, I decided to give Karen one last chance. A peace offering, if you could call it that. I walked over to her front door around midday, official badge clipped to my flannel, folder in hand. I rang the bell twice and waited. When the door finally creaked open, Karen peeked out like she was expecting a lawsuit to materialize right on her porch. Her expression shifted the moment she saw my badge. First confusion, then disbelief. "Are you with the sheriff's department?" she asked, suddenly far more polite. I shook my head and introduced myself properly. "No, ma'am. I'm Thomas Weller, certified rural land assessor for County District 3. I also happen to live on the other side of that fence." I tapped the folder in my hand. "Thought we should talk before this gets more complicated." She narrowed her eyes, then opened the door just enough to lean against the frame, arms folded tight. "You dragged my vehicle into a field," she said flatly. "You committed theft and vandalism." I didn't flinch. "Actually, I relocated an unauthorized vehicle that was blocking commercial farming operations on private land. The sheriff already ruled it was lawful." Then I pulled out the copy of the local road use code and showed her the exact section outlining private drive right. "But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because your recent activities, including removal of posted signage and unauthorized site work, might be in violation of two different zoning ordinances." Karen's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at the page I was pointing to, like it was written in another language. "You're bluffing," she finally muttered. "I'll call the HOA attorney." "You do that," I said calmly. "But you might want to hold off on that tennis court or whatever it is you're building out back. Especially since the runoff map shows your property already borders a protected drainage easement. Any development there without approval could trigger an environmental review. Just a heads up." I turned and walked away, hearing the door slam shut behind me. I didn't expect her to back down that easily, but I had no idea just how petty she could get. The very next day, I came out to feed the goats and found a stack of HOA flyers pinned to my barn wall. Yes, my wall. On my property. The flyers were titled Community Harmony and Safety Notice, and they listed made-up code violations like unauthorized agricultural activity near residential border and potential chemical runoff risks from non-compliant farming practices. At the bottom, they were signed Karen M., interim HOA president. It was so absurd I actually laughed out loud. But the final straw came when my ranch hand Javier showed up that afternoon and told me that Karen had yelled at him through the fence while he was feeding the chickens. She'd accused him of operating a commercial site without HOA approval and threatened to report the entire crew for trespassing. I couldn't believe it. She was now trying to dictate operations on a farm that had existed long before her subdivision was even surveyed. It was like someone moving next to a fire station and then complaining about the sirens. I called the sheriff again, not to press charges this time, but to file a formal complaint about harassment and unauthorized postings. They sent Deputy Hollis, a big guy with a dry sense of humor who'd known me for years. When he saw the flyers on my barn, he raised an eyebrow and said, "She really put HOA flyers on your livestock shed?" I nodded. He took a few photos and promised to issue her a written warning about trespassing and nuisance behavior. He also mentioned that he'd spoken with 2 other property owners on the block who had similar run-ins with Karen, one involving a noise complaint about a 4th of July barbecue and another over a tree that allegedly leaned the wrong way. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping iced tea, I watched Karen pacing back and forth in her yard, phone glued to her ear, waving her arms like she was directing a helicopter landing. I didn't know who she was talking to, but I had a pretty good guess it wasn't going the way she wanted. I had just started to relax when a truck pulled into her driveway, one I recognized. It belonged to the county compliance office. Now things were getting interesting. I stood up and walked to the edge of the fence line. A woman in a navy blue field vest stepped out and began taking measurements along Karen's back lot, right where she'd had that landscaping crew poking around earlier. Karen looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. The compliance officer scribbled something on her clipboard, then turned and asked Karen something I couldn't hear. Karen gestured wildly, pointing toward my farm, probably trying to shift blame. But the officer didn't even glance at me. She just nodded once, got back in her truck, and left. I grinned. She had poked the bear too many times. What she didn't realize yet was that she'd just invited county scrutiny onto herself, and I hadn't even filed my full report yet. The real storm hadn't hit, but it was coming, and she wouldn't be able to park her Lexus or her Pride anywhere near safe ground once it did. The morning after the compliance officer's visit, the atmosphere around Maple Ridge Estates shifted like a storm cloud settling low over the neighborhood. Karen didn't come outside for her usual morning routine. No watering of the flower pots, no power walking around the cul-de-sac with her Bluetooth headset glued to her head. It was unusually quiet, almost suspiciously so, like the eye of a hurricane. I half expected her to emerge with a fresh batch of nonsense, perhaps a drone overhead filming my chickens for a noise violation, but there was nothing. That kind of silence wasn't peace. It was plotting. I had no intention of standing down. That woman had parked on my land, stolen my sign, harassed my workers, posted flyers on my barn, and now she was clearly attempting some illegal development behind her lot. She didn't realize yet that her actions had triggered an avalanche of oversight. County zoning didn't move fast, but it moved deep, and once their wheels turned, they dug into everything. Permits, property lines, prior violations, drainage plans, environmental impact. I'd seen a backyard patio bring down a whole sale before. Doug rolled up in his ATV that afternoon with the kind of smirk that meant he had news. He pulled up under the shade of the oak tree by my porch, leaned back in the seat, and handed me a cold can of root beer. I raised an eyebrow. He only brought drinks when the news was juicy. He popped the tab on his own and said, plain as day, that Karen had called an emergency HOA board meeting at her house. No official notice. No agenda. Just a late-night text chain that went out to the HOA inner circle. He'd heard about it from his cousin Linda, who lived 2 blocks over and served as the HOA treasurer. According to Linda, the entire meeting was focused on one thing, me. Apparently, Karen had pitched a motion to have my land labeled a community nuisance zone. Her plan was to start circulating petitions to have the county pressure me into relocation or regulation by citing safety concerns, dust, noise, and traffic disruptions. I laughed so hard I nearly spit out my drink. She was trying to rewrite geography. It was like trying to evict a mountain because it blocked your view. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just a farmer with some zoning authority. I was also sitting on documents that would unravel her scheme faster than she could blink. I walked into my office and pulled out the master parcel maps for the area, color-coded in green and red. Karen's lot, nestled near the drainage basin, sat on a narrow plot that technically had a 5-foot no-construction buffer along the east line. That buffer ran along my property, where she now had landscaping stakes hammered in, marking what looked like the outline of a patio or structure foundation. If she dug one more hole or poured one drop of concrete, she'd violate Code September 7, 15. It was one of the few codes that could trigger a stop work order within hours if filed correctly. I scanned and uploaded the maps, then drafted a courtesy notice to the compliance office outlining potential encroachment and unpermitted grading. I didn't embellish. I didn't even express personal grievance. Just the facts. The notice would likely trigger a field survey, and if the violations were confirmed, Karen's project would be shut down before it even got going. But still, I wasn't looking for a win by bureaucracy alone. I wanted Karen to realize she wasn't the sheriff of a cul-de-sac. She was just another homeowner living next to someone with actual authority. That night, I went to the local feed store to pick up some fencing material and chicken pellet. While I was loading up my truck, I overheard two HOA residents whispering by the stacked bags of mulch. One of them, a guy named Brad who always wore golf shirts and had a laugh like a squeaky gate, was ranting about how Karen had lied during the board meeting. Apparently, she'd claimed she had legal permission to begin her landscaping project and that my road wasn't technically private because it had once connected to an old public road decades ago. But Brad's wife, who worked at the county archives, had looked it up and found nothing. No easement. No documentation. Just a lot of hot air. That was my cue. I dropped off the materials at home, printed copies of the original access agreement, signed in 2003 by the land developer before Maple Ridge was even built, and went over to the HOA board's temporary office the next morning. It was just a repurposed community room behind the clubhouse, complete with fake wood paneling and mismatched chairs. I walked in, nodded at the startled board members, and calmly handed them the documents. No theatrics, just evidence. Then I said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, that if anyone tried to interfere with my operations again, I would pursue legal remedy not as a neighbor, but as an agent of the county. That turned a few faces pale. Later that day, something even more unexpected happened. A young couple knocked on my door. They were from the far end of the HOA neighborhood, new homeowners, maybe in their late 20s. The woman held a small plate of brownies, and the man looked sheepish as he introduced them. They'd heard about the incident from next door and came to apologize. Apparently, Karen had tried to convince people that I was planning to build a compost facility or install livestock pens near the fence line, which was a lie. They said she was scaring residents into signing petitions under false pretenses. I thanked them and offered to give them a tour of the farm sometime so they could see how clean and regulated everything really was. Their kindness reminded me not everyone in that development was unreasonable, but kindness only carried so far. The next morning, the real chaos began. At 7:15 a.m., two unmarked trucks arrived at Karen's property. Out came two men in county-issued vests, measuring tools in hand. They spent a good half hour in her backyard, pointing at the stakes, taking photos, and walking along the fence line. I watched it all unfold from my side, sipping coffee, feeling vindicated. Around 8 a.m., Karen burst out of her house in a satin robe and marched toward them like she was about to halt an invasion. Arms flailing, voice rising. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but one of the inspectors calmly handed her a paper, then motioned to the backyard. Within minutes, they packed up and left, leaving behind a bright red notice taped to her sliding glass door. Later, Doug confirmed what I suspected. Stop work order. Immediate cease and desist. Further violations would result in fines and potential legal action. Karen had crossed the wrong lines, both literal and legal. But instead of learning from it, she doubled down. That afternoon, she hosted a gathering of her loyalist HOA members in her front yard. Fold-out chairs, clipboards, and lemonade jugs appeared like she was running for neighborhood president. She stood under a makeshift banner that read "Protect Our Streets," and began loudly listing grievances about property lines, dangerous tractors, and declining community image. She even referenced my so-called intimidation tactics. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because as she rallied her supporters, a different kind of vehicle rolled up. A news van from Channel 7. One of the reporters had picked up the zoning notice and, after a quick check on public records, realized there was a story brewing. entitled HOA President Violates Environmental Codes, Clashes with Veteran Landowner. It practically wrote itself. I watched from my porch as they interviewed one of her neighbors who had refused to sign her petition. Then they panned over to the red notice still stuck to her door. By the following morning, the HOA neighborhood was buzzing with more gossip than a high school hallway during prom week. Karen had managed to do the impossible, unite an entire suburban community against her in just under 7 days. The red notice taped to her sliding glass door hadn't just embarrassed her, it had exposed her. People who once blindly followed her HOA updates and parked by her side during meetings were now whispering behind her back. Some were even reaching out to me directly. One guy, a retired Air Force mechanic named Phil, came over just to tell me that Karen had threatened to fine him for using unregistered patio furniture and that he hoped I'd keep rattling her cage. Phil even brought cookies as a peace offering. I didn't need cookies, but I appreciated the gesture. By noon, I got word that Karen had filed a formal grievance with the HOA board against me, citing ongoing intimidation, unauthorized surveillance, malicious property use, and potential environmental sabotage. It was the most bizarre mix of accusations I'd ever heard, as if she had thrown every bad word she knew into one dramatic blender. And even though it was legally meaningless, since the HOA had no jurisdiction over my farm, it showed how desperately she was trying to shift blame. I didn't have to respond, but I decided to send in a polite rebuttal anyway, complete with satellite images, permits, and a very detailed breakdown of every zoning code she'd ignored. I attached the red notice copy, just to be thorough. No embellishment, no threats, just facts. Around 3 p.m., a loud engine growled to life in Karen's driveway. I looked up from my irrigation setup and saw her Lexus, freshly cleaned, with the back hatch propped open. She was pacing next to it with a folding table and a box of flyers. A moment later, she set up a ridiculous little stand near the edge of the street with a handwritten sign that said, "Save our community. Say no to industrial expansion." She even had balloons. I watched her hand out printed sheets accusing me of expanding a large commercial farm that would endanger children, pollute the air, and drive down home values. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerously misleading. I didn't approach her. I didn't even look her way long enough for her to wave one of those flyers at me. Instead, I called someone far more effective than any HOA busybody. My cousin Marlene worked for the state's Agricultural Outreach Division. She had a calm demeanor and a sharp eye for public misinformation. When I explained what was happening, she promised to send over a representative to document the flyer distribution and record any false claims made about local agriculture. The department didn't take kindly to people accusing licensed farms of environmental harm without cause. That kind of baseless fear-mongering could land someone in very real trouble. By sunset, the representative arrived. His name was Clayton, a no-nonsense guy in a khaki shirt with an official badge on one shoulder. He walked straight past Karen's stand, ignored the balloons, and knocked on her door. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw Karen's face twist into a strained smile as she opened the door. It didn't last long. Clayton stood firm while she flailed her arms and waved a flyer in his face. He wrote something on his clipboard, handed her a copy of an official-looking letter, and left without another word. She stood there stunned for a moment, then ripped one of her own flyers in half and slammed the door shut again. The next day was quiet. Too quiet. No cars in front of her house. No HOA patrols doing their usual jog around the block with reflective vests. The community seemed to settle down like a town after a tornado. People were out walking dogs again, chatting by their mailboxes, waving to me like I was part of the neighborhood again, instead of some perceived outsider. I even caught 2 teenage boys taking selfies near my tractor, one of them joking that I was legend status now. Doug called it a ceasefire, but I knew better. Karen hadn't surrendered. She was regrouping. Sure enough, by late afternoon, her next move came, and this one was bold. I heard a knock at my door and opened it to find Deputy Hollis standing there again, clipboard in hand. He looked mildly annoyed but not exactly serious. "We got a call from your neighbor," he said, gesturing toward Karen's house. "She's claiming you stole her car." I blinked, genuinely stunned. "Her car? The same one I moved with my tractor last week?" He nodded slowly. "Yep. Says it was an illegal tow, and now she's adding vandalism to the report." I walked Hollis over to my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the footage from my trail camera. I had placed it a few months back near the barn to track wildlife movement, but it had caught a perfect view of the tractor hauling her Lexus into the field. The footage showed the car being moved slowly, without damage, and clearly parked on my private road. I handed him the memory card and said, "Here you go. It even has audio." Hollis chuckled under his breath, muttered something about wasted taxpayer hours, and left with a pat on my shoulder. He knew this was Karen trying to use law enforcement as her personal army, and it wasn't going to work. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but then came the most ridiculous twist of all. I received a letter, not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from a third-party law firm. It was a cease and desist order accusing me of engaging in behavior that threatened the emotional stability and residential enjoyment of their client. Apparently, dragging her car, filing zoning complaints, and being confrontational, by merely enforcing property rights was now considered harassment. I called the number on the letter, and got a chipper receptionist who redirected me to an associate named Chad. Chad sounded like he had just graduated law school 2 months ago and thought HOA bylaws outranked the U.S. Constitution. I let him go through his little speech, then asked if he'd like a copy of the sheriff's statement, the zoning documents, and the footage of the Lexus. He hesitated. I pressed further, saying that if his firm proceeded with any claims, I'd respond with a defamation countersuit and an abuse of process complaint. Suddenly, Chad's tone shifted. He said he'd review the case further, and hung up without another word. Another bluff, another failure. And then, finally, came the moment I didn't expect. That evening, while I was closing the barn gate, Karen walked up to the fence. No balloons. No clipboard. No sunglasses. She looked different, tired, worn out, even a little embarrassed. She cleared her throat and said, "I didn't know you were a county assessor." I nodded but didn't speak. She fidgeted with her watch, then said, "I may have overreacted." That was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get, and while I didn't trust her suddenly growing a conscience, I could tell she knew she had lost. All her attempts to control, accuse, and dominate had backfired spectacularly. I simply replied, "You don't have to like me, Karen. But you do have to respect my land." She nodded slowly, turned around, and walked away without another word. For the first time in days, I felt the air settle again. Not like a victory, not like a win, but like balance being restored. Maybe she'd think twice before trying to dictate terms to someone who knew every rule in the book better than she ever would. And if not, well, the tractor was still parked by the barn. Just in case. 3 days passed without a single peep from Karen. No flyers, no false reports, no wild accusations hurled across the fence. I didn't hear her voice, didn't see her pacing in the yard, and for a while, it was tempting to believe the storm had passed. The quiet was almost unsettling, like that calm silence after a thunderclap when you wait to see if the power goes out. But I knew better than to believe someone like her could just let things go. People like Karen didn't retreat. They regrouped. They paused to reload. The peace finally shattered early Saturday morning, just as I was loading feed sacks into the back of my truck. A black SUV pulled up to the end of my gravel road, and 3 people got out, one in a suit, one with a clipboard, and the third wearing a camera around his neck. I watched from a distance as they snapped photos of my gate, the tractor, the barn, and the freshly mowed field. They never stepped onto my property, but their intentions were loud and clear. I approached them slowly, making sure to stay calm. The man in the suit turned and introduced himself as an independent property valuation officer. He claimed he was conducting a preliminary assessment on behalf of the HOA to determine whether my property was in violation of new proximity standards being proposed for community safety. I almost laughed. Proposed standard, which meant they weren't laws, codes, or even real guidelines, just ideas someone like Karen had cooked up to dress her vendetta in official-sounding clothes. I politely asked if they had any legal documentation granting them access or authority. The man in the suit hesitated, then admitted they were operating on community concerns and policy interest. That was enough for me. I told them to leave, reminded them they were bordering private property, and that if I saw anyone cross the line again without proper county authorization, I'd report them for trespassing. They left without further drama, but their visit proved that Karen still had cards she wanted to play. She wasn't done, just playing the long game. That same afternoon, I met with Deputy Hollis to file a formal incident report regarding the attempted assessment. He agreed it was overreach and made a note in the sheriff's log to flag any future HOA interference on my land. He also told me, with a bit of a grin, that he'd been contacted by 3 other homeowners in Maple Ridge who had their own complaints against Karen. One said she tried to fine him for installing a hammock between 2 trees. Another said she demanded he repaint his front door because it was too rustic. It was all unraveling, and people were noticing. But then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at my home. Not from a lawyer, not from the HOA, but from the county commissioner's office. It informed me that, due to multiple citizen complaints, my property had been flagged for an official review of land usage compliance. I couldn't believe it. Somehow, Karen had managed to trigger a county-level response. She must have gathered enough signatures or fabricated enough concern to make it seem legitimate. My jaw clenched as I read through the pages. While I knew everything on my end was legal, the process of a county review was tedious, time-consuming, and absolutely unnecessary. Still, I wasn't the kind of man to panic. I got to work. I gathered every permit, every inspection record, every tax document that proved my operation was in full compliance. I had a binder thicker than a phone book by the time I was done. The review date was set for the following week, but I wasn't about to sit back and wait. I made a few calls of my own, one to the State Agricultural Board, another to a friend in the commissioner's office, and a third to a local news reporter who had already done one segment on Karen's zoning violations. I didn't want to go nuclear, but I also wasn't going to let my livelihood be bullied into some bureaucratic limbo because of one entitled woman with a grudge. And then, the final straw dropped. That night, while walking my perimeter fence with a flashlight, I noticed something off in the northeast corner of my field. The wire had been cut. A clean, deliberate slice through 2 of the strands. And lying in the grass, tangled and bent, was one of my private property and no trespassing signs. It wasn't weather damage. It wasn't accidental. Someone had crossed into my land again. I reviewed the security footage the next morning. Around 2:14 a.m., a figure could be seen moving near the fence line. The camera didn't catch a clear face, but the posture and build looked familiar. Slim, deliberate, hunched slightly, like someone trying too hard not to be noticed. I saved the footage and handed it straight to the sheriff's office. Hollis took one look and said, "This is enough for a warrant if we can tie it to her." He also advised me to install motion-activated spotlights, which I did that afternoon. I wasn't taking any chances. But then came the twist I never expected. 2 days before the county review, Karen's husband, whom I had only seen once or twice, and who had always seemed to keep his distance from her antics, showed up at my gate. He wore a ball cap, jeans, and a look that said he wasn't here to argue. I met him halfway down the path, not sure what to expect. He cleared his throat and said, "I want to apologize for everything my wife has put you through." I was stunned silent for a second. He went on to explain that he had been out of town on work for weeks, and when he returned, he found their home in a state of chaos. Karen had hidden most of what had been going on from him. He had no idea she'd involved law firms, reporters, or the county. When he saw the stop work notice and watched her arguing with the HOA treasurer on the lawn, he started asking questions. What he found out floored him. He told me he planned to step in and take her off any further HOA duties. He was even considering having her see someone professionally. Apparently, this wasn't the first time her obsession with control had gotten out of hand. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked him in the eye and asked, "You really didn't know?" He shook his head. Not until it was too far gone. That conversation did more to resolve things than any legal threat or zoning board. The day of the county review came and went without incident. The inspector reviewed my land, checked the paperwork, and left impressed. He even commented on how rare it was to see everything in order with such precision. I offered him a cup of coffee, and he smiled as he declined, saying, "You've got nothing to worry about here." And just like that, the final shot Karen tried to fire had fizzled before it left the barrel. In the weeks that followed, I saw less and less of her. Word around the HOA was that she had stepped down from her position, citing personal matters. The lawn signs disappeared. The tone of the neighborhood softened. One of the board members even asked if I'd be willing to help mediate a future conversation about property line buffers. Not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. But it was progress. And as for me, I went back to what I